Let's begin by defining. Thanks. First of all, let me say welcome.
Thank you. Very
I wanted
glad
us to
be here.
begin, first of all, by just defining this duty of care. What does it entail?
Employer duty of care is the obligation of the employer to protect its employees, the health, safety, and security of its workers when they send them abroad, as you said, as international assignees or business travelers, but also their local employees that they have in the region.
Yeah. Now, when you look at the work that you have done across Africa, what's your sense in terms of how we stack up against the global standards?
Well, you actually stack up very nicely. You are operating at the worldwide baseline. There's some countries that operate above and some below, and you're at the baseline.
Right.
But what's really interesting in Africa is what I kind of would label the African paradox.
Right.
They're very high on risk, perceived risk and real risk. Very high on awareness of duty of care, probably because it is so risky to operate.
Yeah.
A high sense of moral responsibility in spite of the fact that there is very little legal responsibility on the continent.
Right.
But by the same token, this high awareness, the execution and the planning just isn't there.
Yeah. When you look at the companies operating in Africa, we of course have our own indigenous companies, and then you've got, of course, the international companies, you know, your Walmarts, your SAB Millers, and your Tokyo Anglo-Americans, etc. When you compare the standards at our companies versus those that come from abroad into Africa, how far are we?
Actually, when you compare, there is a difference. My sample is made up of mainly South African indigenous companies, as you said, but also global 500 companies that operate in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. And the global companies operate at a much higher level than the South African companies. So if I only took the South African companies, they would be below the baseline.
Why is that? Don't they want to spend money on their employees?
It's not a question of spending just money on your employees. It's a question of it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You're not going to be very sustainable if your employees get injured, and it's a very high business cost. The business case is just overwhelming. I think it's a lack of execution. It's a lack of the various stakeholders in the companies to get together and to put this to the attention of senior management, because ultimately senior management is responsible.
Absolutely. This is an issue that we deal with here at CNBC Africa as well, because as we grow into Africa, we also find that these issues are beginning to come up in play. So what needs to change? What needs to be improved to get it right?
Actually,
and I'm generalizing here because obviously there will be different requirements in South Africa, in other parts of Africa, etc.
In general, the things that need to be done around the world, the best practices are very similar, but they need to be customized to the region. And in terms of duty of care here in the region, the companies that come here or that operate here, they can't do it themselves. They first of all need medical and risk experts, such as the ones at International SOS, that really know how to do this.
Sure.
But then they also need to work with local vendors. They need to work with local management. And this is not just a question of cost, it's a question of what we call agency cost. It's the time you need to spend to organize, plan, and execute properly. One of the hypotheses is that you may perhaps not have the execution capability. I don't believe that. I do believe it's a question of will.
I actually wanted to ask that question because I was going to ask if it's the perennial problem of Africa, you know, a lack of skills, a lack of capacity to plan for these things.
No, because we have, for example, a lot of NGOs, Western NGOs that operate in Africa, and you can't say that they have a lot of resources, but they really do have the well-being of the employee in mind.
Yeah. Now, so in terms of that planning and overall implementation, does that just affect the Africa-based companies, or are we talking global here?
Global. But there may be a little cultural impact here in Africa, a little laissez-faire of when you need to implement something. And but by industry, it's quite different. Some industries, like the financial industry, has a certain discipline with money, and they can transfer that discipline to people.
Is this standard across Africa, or are we talking different geographies here?
I wouldn't say that it's one Africa. I think it's probably the type of industry, the size of company, whether they're a global 500 company or not. They obviously have more know-how, not just more resources, but more know-how because they've had more incidents. Yeah,
I ask because, you know, as you know, Africa is 54 countries that are around this continent, and the conditions are very diverse, from conflict in Somalia to perhaps more stability in South Africa, and perhaps less stability in parts, including the DRC, you know, Angola, etc., etc. When you look there, is there a particular region that's performing best?
Well, I wouldn't say a particular region that's performing best.
I wanted you to name countries, but I'm going to be careful.
No, I'm not going to name countries. What I'm going to say is that you are right that it's about terrorism, it's about political unrest, but it's really also the three major significant risks in Africa are number one, infectious diseases, number two, road accidents, and number three, work accidents. And those are all very preventable with good planning.
Absolutely. Professor Lisbeth Claus, Professor at Atkinson Graduate School of Management. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today.